The hardest thing I have ever had to admit, harder than the cheating itself, harder than the lies, harder than watching the man I loved absorb the news of what I had done, is this. He gave me everything. Not almost everything. Not everything except one thing. Everything. Stability, devotion, patience, presence, a home, a future, a love so consistent and so thorough that our friends used to joke that he had set an impossible standard for every other man in existence. He gave me all of it. And I still sat across from him at our dinner table, night after night, feeling like something was missing. And then I went looking for it. And what I found was not what I needed. And what I lost was everything he had given me. Before you judge me, tell me where you're watching from. I've judged myself enough for both of us, trust me. But I want you to stay, because this story is about something most people won't say out loud, the terrifying possibility that enough is never enough, and what happens when you act on that. Drop a comment. Tell me where you are. His name was Theo. We had been together for 4 years when everything collapsed, living together for 2 of those. The last 6 months of which I had been conducting something I am going to call what it was. An affair. Not a moment of weakness. Not a single reckless night. A sustained, deliberate, carefully managed affair with a man named Cole who gave me almost nothing that Theo didn't already give me, but gave it with an uncertainty I had apparently been craving without knowing I was craving it. I need to go back further than that to make this make any sense, because the affair was not the beginning of this story. It was the consequence of something that had been growing in me for years, something I had no clean name for and no appropriate outlet for, something I kept circling without ever landing on directly. I grew up watching my parents in a marriage that was, by objective measure, a good one. My father was faithful and present and hardworking. My mother was warm and capable and deeply involved in the life of our family. They did not fight dramatically or often. They were not the kind of parents whose relationship produced trauma in any identifiable sense. But there was something between them, in the way they looked at each other, or rather in the way they didn't look at each other, that communicated a kind of settled resignation. They had landed somewhere safe and stopped flying, and I absorbed that image from childhood as a warning. Safe equals stopped. Settled equals finished. I did not want to be finished. I had never examined that belief carefully enough to see how distorted it was. I had simply carried it, unquestioned, into every relationship I had ever been in. Theo and I met when I was 24. He was 27, working in architecture, the kind of man who brought the same considered attention to the people in his life that he brought to his work. He noticed things. He remembered what mattered to you and acted on it without being asked. Our first year was the most genuinely loving relationship I had ever been in, not the most dramatic, not the most intense, but the most real, the most adult. The most characterized by actual care, rather than the performance of it. By year 2, I was living with him, and by year 3, something had begun in me that I did not immediately recognize for what it was. A restlessness. A low-level, persistent dissatisfaction that had no specific object. Theo hadn't changed. He was still the same man, still noticing, still showing up, still loving me with the same considered, thorough attention he always had. The relationship hadn't deteriorated. I had shifted somehow, internally, and the shift produced a dissonance between what I had and what some part of me seemed to want, and I had no idea how to bridge it. I tried to understand it by talking to Theo. "Do you ever feel like we've become too comfortable?" I said one evening. We were cooking dinner together, which was something we did most nights, one of the small, ordinary rituals that made up the warmth of our shared life. He looked at me. "Too comfortable how?" "Like, I don't know. Like the uncertainty is gone. Like everything is already decided." "Is that a bad thing?" I stirred something on the stove. "I don't know. I just wonder sometimes if I miss the part where you don't know how it's going to go." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very gently, "Mia, I think you might be describing the difference between early-stage love and real love. The not knowing feeling is anxiety. This is the other side of it." I knew he was right. I also knew that knowing he was right was not the same as feeling it, and that the feeling, the unnamed, directionless wanting, was still present regardless of the intellectual clarity of his response. I said, "Maybe you're right," and I let the conversation close and I did not reopen it. That decision, to stop rather than keep. Going to accept his clarity rather than push past it into the messier truth of what I was actually feeling, was the choice that began the wall between us. One conversation closed, then another. Then the wall was built. I met Cole through a friend's gathering in the summer of year 3. He was a musician, not successful in any significant commercial sense, but working toward something, caught in the specific and magnetic atmosphere of someone who is reaching for a thing they haven't caught yet. He was unpredictable in a way that I felt in my chest before I registered it in my mind. He did not seem to have decided anything about his life yet. And something in me, trained since childhood to interpret unsettled as alive, responded to that with a recognition that was immediate and entirely inappropriate. I did not do anything that first evening. I registered the attraction, kept it to myself, went home to Theo, and lay in the dark for an hour longer than I needed to. That was all. But the registration had occurred, and the registration had been placed in the part of my mind that stores things I return to. Cole followed me on social media a week later. I followed back. The following happened, as these things tend to happen, in increments so small that the cumulative distance they covered only becomes visible when you stop and look back at where you started. A comment on a post, a direct message, an exchange that began as light and became warmer, a conversation that covered ground I had stopped covering with Theo, not because Theo was unwilling, but because I had stopped initiating. With Cole, I was initiating everything. He was the uncertain variable. He might respond or might not, might be warm one day and distant the next, might make a plan and change it. And every time he did, I felt the specific charge of a nervous system that had been trained to read unpredictability as importance. I want to be honest about what I understand now that I did not understand then. I was not falling for Cole. I was falling for the feeling his unpredictability produced in me. I was, in the specific and humbling language of adult self-understanding, acting out a childhood template. I had equated uncertainty with aliveness for so long that I could not experience genuine, consistent, healthy love as fully alive. And Theo's love, which was as real and as alive as love gets, felt, to my miscalibrated nervous system, like the thing I had spent my whole life afraid of becoming. Settled, finished, safe. I moved the messages to a private channel in week 3. Another brick. Another choice that looked small in the moment and was not. We met in person for the first time in September. I told Theo I was going to a colleague's birthday drinks. I was precise about the lies, specific enough to be convincing, vague enough not to require too much maintenance. I had become, by then, frightened by how naturally the lying came, not remorseful enough to stop. Just frightened, in an abstract way, at my own facility for it. Coffee stretched to 3 hours. Cole was exactly what the texts had suggested, warm in the unreliable way of someone whose warmth cannot be counted on, which made it feel more significant each time it arrived. He talked about himself in the way of someone who found himself genuinely interesting, which is different from arrogance. It was more like wonder, and wonder, in a person, is magnetic. He asked about me in the way of someone gathering information rather than the way of someone who genuinely wanted to understand, but I did not see that distinction then. I saw only that he was asking. I drove home and sat in the car outside our building for 10 minutes, not deciding anything, or deciding and not wanting to call it that. What followed over the next 4 months I will describe honestly, and without the softening that the passage of time sometimes makes possible. I conducted an affair, not a passionate, all-consuming thing of the kind that gets romanticized in films. A grubby, logistically demanding, emotionally exhausting parallel existence. I managed Theo's world on one side with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what was at stake, and I managed Cole on the other with the confused, escalating investment of someone who had mistaken the feeling for the person. I told myself various things during this period, as people in this situation reliably do. I told myself it was filling something Theo couldn't fill, without ever honestly examining whether Theo had been given the actual opportunity to fill it. I told myself Theo would be happier not knowing, which was the most self-serving thought I had during the entire period, and the one I most need to own. I told myself I could manage it indefinitely, which was not a belief so much as a bet against probability. Theo noticed something in November. We were lying in bed, Saturday morning, the specific ease of a day with no obligations, and he turned to look at me with the attentiveness that had always been his particular quality, and said, "Something's different. I don't know what it is, but something is different." I looked at him, this man who had given me everything, who noticed the small shifts in my presence with more accuracy than I gave him credit for, who loved me with a steadiness I had been too broken, in some specific internal way, to fully receive. "I'm just tired," I said. "I've had a lot going on." He held my eyes for a moment. "Is it something about us?" "No," I said. He nodded, did not fully believe me, I think, but accepted it because he trusted me, and trusting me was what he had always done. The discovery happened in December, not through a dramatic confrontation, but through an accident so small it should not have had the weight it did. A notification appeared on my phone while it was charging on the kitchen counter, a name, a preview of a message. Theo happened to walk past at exactly the moment it appeared. He stopped, looked at the screen, looked at me across the kitchen. He did not say anything for a long time. Then, "Who is Cole?" The specific way he said the name told me he had already constructed the outline of the answer, that he needed confirmation, not information. I could have lied. I had been lying for 4 months. The machinery was assembled and functional. I could have offered an explanation that was plausible enough to create doubt and buy time. I looked at Theo, at his face, which was calm in the way of someone trying very hard to stay calm, and I understood that I was not going to lie to him. That something in me had arrived, finally, at the place where the cost of continuing was higher than the cost of telling the truth. I told him. He sat down while I was still talking. At some point, he put his hands on the table in front of him and looked at them rather than at me, and I kept talking, and when I finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "How long?" he said. 4 months. He processed that. He stopped. While everything was normal, while we were having dinners and going to things and being, he stopped again. "Yes," I said. He looked up at me then. "Why, Mia, I need you to tell me honestly. What was missing? What did you need that I wasn't giving you?" And this is the question I have sat with for years since, because the honest answer is so deeply uncomfortable that I spent a long time refusing to say it out loud. But he asked for honesty, and he deserved it. "Nothing," I said. "Nothing was missing. You gave me everything. And something in me, something I didn't understand about myself, couldn't settle into that, couldn't receive it. And instead of trying to understand that and fix it, I went looking for something that felt more familiar, something uncertain. Because uncertain felt alive to me and certain felt like something I was afraid of." He stared at me. "You're telling me you did this because I was too good to you." "I'm telling you I did this because I had something broken in me that I didn't deal with, and you paid for it." He stood up. He walked out of the kitchen and down the hallway, and I heard the front door open and then close, not slammed, just closed, with a finality that was worse than any sound. A secondary thing I had not anticipated. Cole, when I told him what had happened, that everything had been discovered and that I was ending it, was not devastated. He was not particularly moved. He said with the casual ease of someone for whom this was familiar territory, "These things happen. I hope it works out for you." That was all. Not cruelty, just indifference. The genuine, uncomplicated indifference of someone who had never been as invested as I had convinced myself he was. I had risked and lost a relationship of 4 years with a man who had loved me thoroughly and completely, for a person who felt nothing particular about the loss. I sat with that for a long time. It remains one of the more clarifying experiences of my life. Theo and I did not recover. He gave me 3 weeks to find somewhere else to stay, which was generous and entirely like him. We had one more real conversation in that period, not about logistics, but about the thing itself, where he said something I carry still. "I think you needed to figure out whether you were capable of receiving love. And I think you needed to do that before being in a relationship. And I think part of me always sensed that you were still working that out, and I stayed anyway, and I don't regret staying, but I wish." He paused. I wish you had told me you were still working it out instead of working it out on me." He was right, simply and completely right in a way that required no qualification. I moved out in January. The social fallout was quiet, but real friends who had been our friends becoming his friends, which was fair, which I accepted without argument. My sister was the person who said the hardest true thing. "You always said you were afraid of becoming your parents. But what you did was worse than anything they did, because they stayed. They chose it every day. That's not settling, that's deciding." I have thought about that distinction for years. The difference between settling and deciding. The difference between safety as resignation and safety as choice. I had been running from one without understanding the other, and I had run so hard and so far that I had destroyed the best thing I had ever been given. I am 30 years old now. I have done more therapy than I ever expected to need, which is another way of saying I have done exactly as much as I actually needed. I have come to understand the specific calibration error in my nervous system, the one that reads consistency as danger and uncertainty as aliveness, not as an excuse, but as a mechanism. Something that can be seen and named, and with enough sustained attention, gradually recalibrated. I am in a relationship now, carefully and intentionally, with someone who is, yes, steady and present and consistent. And I am doing the active, deliberate work of telling the feeling when it arises, the restless one, the one that reads this goodness as a ceiling, that it is not information about the relationship. It is information about me, and that the work of addressing it belongs in my own hands, not in a secret maintained at someone else's expense. Theo deserved someone who could receive what he gave. I was not, at that time, that person. I am working every day to become her. What I want to leave you with is a question, not a comfortable one. If you are in a relationship with someone who gives you everything, and you still feel the restlessness, the unnamed want, the pull toward something uncertain, before you act on it, I am asking you to sit with one question. Is the problem the relationship, or is it you? Because those two things require completely different responses, and getting them mixed up is how you end up exactly where I ended up. Having destroyed the best thing you ever had, to chase the feeling that turned out to be empty, while the person who loved you most collects his things in silence and closes the door. Leave a comment if this reached you. Tell me where you are with it, and I will see you in the next one.